loudly. Good morning. My name is Dr. Isabel Martinez, and it gives me great pleasure to be the first person to welcome you this morning to the second annual CUNY Institute of Mexican Studies Conference, Mexico, New York, 30 Years of Migration. I'm fortunate enough to be faculty here at John Jay in the Department of Latin American and Latino Studies, and as such, I've been given the responsibility of introducing our first speaker, who will officially give conference participants la bienvenida to our wonderful college. Interim Associate Provost for Research, Anthony Carpi, has demonstrated a lengthy career dedicated to environmental justice in the Northeast and here at John Jay. A graduate of Cornell University's illustrious environmental toxicology PhD program, Professor Carpi first began his career with the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection and then later with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. More recently, however, he has demonstrated his commitment to global justice through research as a Fulbright scholar studying the effects of slash and burn deforestation on the emission of mercury soils and its impacts on human health in Brazil. Professor Carpi joined the faculty at John Jay in 1997 and is currently a professor of physical chemistry. In his capacity as professor, he has demonstrated an unwavering commitment to increasing rates of first-generation and minority student entry into STEM careers and promoting reasoning and research skills in and outside of the classroom. This is best exemplified in his founding and directing of PRISM, the program of research initiatives for science majors at John Jay and other services which have increased graduation rates threefold and increased the number of students, especially Latino and Black students, moving on to doctoral programs from our science programs. His tireless work has resulted in numerous national awards, including the Presidential Award for Science, Math, and Engineering Mentoring from the White House in 2011. Although his tenure as Interim Associate Provost for Research has not been lengthy, Professor Carpi has already proven to be a major asset to faculty and the research and has more than demonstrated his commitment to facilitating the work of a diverse corpus of researchers dedicated to issues of justice in Latin America and more specifically in Mexico. I can personally attest to this from my own experience in sharing my research with him on Mexican unaccompanied youth. During our meetings, Provost Carpi has not only genuinely been interested in my work, but more importantly, he has repeatedly demonstrated much generosity in supporting its progress. For these reasons, it gives me great pleasure to introduce and give a warm welcome to Interim Associate Provost of Research, Professor Anthony Carpi.
Thank you, and thank you, Isabel. I think from now on I'll have you introduce me because I sound so good. Let me tell you what a pleasure it is for me to be here with you at this conference, and more importantly, how important it is for John Jay to be hosting this conference. As all of you know, John Jay is an institution that's focused on justice and all of its various incantations. However, some of you might not know that John Jay is also one of the largest four-year Hispanic-serving institutions in the northeastern United States, and we very much pride ourselves on this designation. If you have the opportunity to walk down the halls as classes are changing, while you might get trampled by the many students that move through the halls, you'll get a sense of the rich diversity of the college, which really reflects the diversity of New York City. Thus, we're truly delighted to host this conference that focuses on Mexico-New York immigration. As an institution for which this community means so much to, and as a national leader committed to educating for justice, the Mexican and Latin American diaspora make up a critical component of this city and this college's future. As a community of scholars, we're committed to understanding and proposing solutions to the particular civil, political, education, and human rights challenges that face Mexicans in New York and more broadly in the United States. This is done by the work of many, but at John Jay it includes Dr. Martinez's research on the participation of unaccompanied Mexican migrant teenagers in the education and labor systems in New York City. It also includes Dr. Brian Montez's research on the Mayan identity in East Quintana Roo, and Dr. Belinda Rincon's research on war and militarism in Chicana literature. Our Department of Latin American and Latina Studies has been at the forefront of these scholarly endeavors, and the chair of that department, Dr. Lysandra Perez, is also chairing an ad hoc committee at John Jay on international programs and exploring potential collaborations with Mexican universities. So we very much appreciate the opportunity to host this distinguished group at the college. As I understand it, this event will build on the accomplishments of a year-long Mexico, New York virtual seminar series that the CUNY Institute of Mexican Studies has coordinated between Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Pueblo, and I apologize to the Spanish speakers. I've been trained in Portuguese, not Spanish, and CUNY. And we look forward to a very, very productive conference here. Again, welcome to you all, and we're happy to host you. Let me now introduce a distinguished colleague and a very good friend of John Jay College, Dr. Ricardo Fernandez, president of Lehman College.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carpi. Let me say that I'm really very pleased to be here for this first anniversary of the Institute for Mexican Studies. And I think it's very appropriate that it be held at John Jay. It's very appropriate that it be held here at John Jay, an institution, as was pointed out, is committed to the pursuit of justice in all its ways. Last year, we had the inaugural conference, which marked the beginning of the Institute, and it's followed this year by another conference full of work and presentations by major scholars from all over the country. This is as it was conceived and developed, this institute is a CUNY-wide institute, and the purpose is, of course, to cover the entire city of New York and share what we know and involve various communities in the work of the institute. At Lehman, we're very proud to be the home of the institute, but we want to share with everybody, and we have, in fact, in its important work. And the Institute does many things. In addition to doing research and teaching and scholarship, it also is very heavily invested in finding assistance, scholarships, and other support for students. New York has always been a very immigrant-friendly institution, and CUNY is, of course, has from its very beginning, its very nature, is a immigrant-friendly institution in this city. This is, of course, as many of you probably know, this is the first such institute on the East Coast of the United States. Having come from the Midwest and Milwaukee, I'm no stranger to the presence of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. In fact, most of my original contacts when I spent many years in Wisconsin came from South Texas, California, Arizona, and other Colorado, other states. I'm proud to say now that according to some of the statistics, and you'll see many more today, the Bronx is now the home of about a quarter of the Mexicans living in the city of New York. That's approximation. Who knows? Who knows what the numbers ultimately are? But the student population in CUNY has grown significantly. And in the Mexican student population in the last 13 years has gone, according to the numbers that someone provided me, I don't vouch for these numbers, 265%. I don't know what the N was initially, but it has grown significantly. These are, I think, outstanding and astounding numbers, and we simply cannot ignore that. As I said before, the work of the Institute involves all of the colleges of the CUNY system and speaks to the traditional role that CUNY has played. and that is uplifting and transforming the lives of its students. I just saw a recent study put out by the Pew Hispanic Trust that provided a wealth of information on Mexicans, people, Hispanics of Mexican descent. And there's been a significant growth in the native-born population. They constitute now about approximately 2/3 of all Hispanics of Mexican descent. 1/3 of them are immigrants. And I commend that study for you. It came out at the very beginning of this month. And if you go to the Pew Hispanic Trust webpage, you will find that. Also of interest is one that came out yesterday that talks about graduation rates for Hispanics that are now at a higher rate than even for white students. We're still trying to understand what's going on, probably involving the collapse of the economy in the United States. But it's good to see that there are more Hispanics now attending college or interested in college. That's the good news. The bad news is that we still know that Hispanics tend to graduate at a lower rate than most students. They tend to go to community colleges. A lot of them who do enroll don't finish. So there's a tremendous amount of work that still needs to be done. So I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very supportive of the work of the Institute and its director, Professor Alicia Galvez, who was one of the people who provided the driving force to make this institute become a reality. So I look forward to listening and being part of the conversation this morning. And I look forward to next year's conference of the Institute, somewhere else in the City University. Thank you very much.
Buenos días. You guys don't know the great pleasure that it gives me to be standing before you this morning. My heart is pounding because it means, and I will tell you in a little while, how much of a journey and how far we've gotten that this conference is taking place this morning. I would like to thank John Jay College, President Travis, Associate Provost Carpi, President Fernandez, for this great effort and collaboration to make this conference come about. 33 years ago, a young, curious boy was taken out of a small village in the state of Puebla called Tulcingo. And he was taken to this huge city called New York City. It was April. It was mid-April, April 12th, as a matter of fact. It was a Tuesday. My grandfather said, do not travel on a Tuesday, and we traveled on a Tuesday. And it was snowing in New York City. Think about it. My village is a semi-dry climate. It was nothing like the place I'd ever seen. It was the late 70s, early 80s. I remember New York City back then was recuperating from a very difficult financial situation. Burnt buildings all over the place. And the train sounded to me like dragons. I've never seen a dragon, but I imagined the sound of the subways was what the sound of a dragon would make when they were moving. My life was turned upside down. I didn't really understand why my parents had to leave the comfort of our home. We were farmers. We lived in a village. We had our family. We went to church. Everything seemed perfect. And then one day, we woke up and we were in the city. And I woke up in Bushwick, Brooklyn, New York. Okay? Remember crossing a park to go to the school. I didn't understand anything. Eventually, I was put in a bilingual class. But it just transformed the way I saw the world. It was no longer a just world. It was just a world that made no sense to me, because how can this young boy who's supposedly behaving and doing his work all of a sudden be found in a city that didn't really make sense to him? My parents were working full-time, both of them. They didn't have much time to be with us, but they always told us that the purpose of us being here was to find a better life. And back then, to me, a better life meant, you know, a bigger house and perhaps having a color TV and other things that now, please, don't make sense, right? But my father always said to me that whatever I learned and whatever he taught me to be a better person was to make sure that I always learned from what I got, be grateful for what I got, and to give back. Needless to say that those experiences shape who I am today. And I'm very fortunate to be in a position where I work for the City University of New York, doing the thing that I love the most, which is giving access to higher education to people who need it. In 2000, I met Professor Smith, Alan Wernick, Vice Chancellor Hershenson, Angelo Cabrera, who's here today, and all, I guess, the universe conspired to make this possible. And the conversation at that time was, how can we open the doors and how can we engage the community to make sure that the children of the immigrants have access to CUNY, to continue the mission of the City University of New York with the Mexican community, who was the workforce of the city. And of course, back then I told Professor Smith, who's in the back, I said, imagine we had a job where we can have conversations and we would go out to the community and talk to them and let them know that the university does not, you don't have to have papers to come to college, that they have scholarships, and there's a world of difference between coming to the school, being in New York and going to college and just existing and working in New York. And he said to me, compadre, one day we'll make it happen. So Professor Smith, you know, thank you for that push. Thank you for that motivation. In 2005, Consul Sarukan met with Vice Chancellor Hershenson, and they signed an MOU. And the conversation was taken to another level. They formed the task force, the CUNY Mexican Task Force, which somehow, somewhere, somebody said, maybe Jesus should be involved. And I was able to become their executive director. And I remember Vice Chancellor Hershenson saying to me, Jesus, do you understand the magnitude of this role? And I said, yes. And he said to me, you're going to be busy. And I said, I know. Tell me how to do that. And he said, just make sure you delegate. Those were the words he said to me. Learn to delegate. And I said, okay, does that mean I stop being the director of academic advisement at Brooklyn College? He said to me, no. You just have to do it better, and you have to split yourself in two. Just learn from me. And I said, okay. So I've ever since been learning from Vice Chancellor Hershenson how he does it, and it's very hard, but a lot of fun. I just want to end by saying that the Institute of Mexican Studies, it's possible because of a lot of work of many people. A lot of people who give because they care, because they want to make a difference and continue the mission. I want to acknowledge President Fernandez for always being there. One of the things that the chancellor said to me, in order for us to have an institute, we need a president who's willing to support it. And not many people will do that, Jesus. When he reached out to President Fernandez, he said yes, yes, yes. And he's always been there for the institute. He will have it at Lehman, he said. He will push for it. And the person who brought it about was Professor Alicia Galvez. Vice Chancellor Hershenson said, there's a process. Here's the process. Let's make sure, let's put it together. And Professor Galvez reached out to her colleagues, and she convened a few meetings, and she worked out with the associate, the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, and everything came together. So a year later, we're standing here, and we're celebrating the victories and the things, and of course, the challenges that are facing the Institute. I want to acknowledge also the presence of our friends from the Universidad Autónoma de Puebla. If you can please stand up so we can acknowledge that you are here with us this morning. And their presence means a lot to me because the conversation now, it's New York, Poblanos, Puebla, and the Poblanos are in the picture. The research that is taking place and the applicability of that research will transform families, lives, people's futures. So I hope that this is the first year of many, many more years to come. I really ask you to please support the Institute, support the IME Becas, support the future of a community that is yearning to grow and to have its place in American society. I hope we have a wonderful conference. On behalf of Senior Vice Chancellor Hershenson, I wish you the best, and I look forward to speaking and meeting with all of you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jesus. So welcome. My name is Alicia Galvez. I'm the director of the CUNY Institute of Mexican Studies. It's such a pleasure to see you all here, to have you all here at our second annual conference post-foundation of the Institute. We actually had several conferences that preceded the foundation of the Institute, coordinated by the task force. But we really consider this to be our first birthday party. So we're happy that you're here to celebrate with us. And we are so happy that we were able to achieve the presence of our colleagues from Puebla, our colleagues Dr. Federico Becerret, Leticia Calderon, Jaime Garcia Leva, who are from other institutions in Mexico, as well as colleagues who've come from other parts of the United States. This is the first time that we've gotten so ambitious in bringing people from other places to the conference, and we're very thrilled about that. And this conference, really, we wanted it to commemorate a marking point. The marking point is a little bit arbitrary. 30 years is completely inexact. It doesn't really mean anything. If you look at it closely enough, it slips away, because obviously there have been Mexicans in New York always. There were Mexicans in New York before New York was New York, when it was Dutch. There were Mexicans in New York, during the Revolution, during the independence period. There have always been Mexicans in New York. But really, if we read my colleague Robert Smith's book, Mexican New York, we see that in the early 80s things started to change. And in the process that Jesus just described so beautifully, there was a big shift. There was a shift in numbers. There was a shift in reasons why people were coming, the intentions that they had. They may not have explained to their 8-year-old sons, but the roots that people put down, maybe not immediately, but over time, during the last 3 decades. And I know, just as a transplanted Californian, the difference, over time, just in the years that I've been living in New York, in terms of, to see this room, to be able to get fresh pan dulce for our conference. When I moved here, I remember tortillas in cans, and other abominations like that. So I think, we wanted to recognize and celebrate what's really 30 years of massive migration. And that migration is nothing without considering the impact and the importance of the relationship between Puebla and New York. Today, one of the things that I always say in my writing is, the population is so diverse, you can't assume people are from Puebla. But if we're talking about 30 years of Mexican migration to New York, the story starts with a story about Puebla and New York City. And so we're so excited to have you here to hear the experts in the field talk about this migration over the last 30 years. I just want to give some thank yous. Today would not happen without my colleague Isabel Martinez. Wave your hand. I've always, since the moment I met her and knew about her work, I've always admired Isabel, but you don't know anything until you've organized a conference with her. She's amazing. So if you have the opportunity to do a crazy, complicated, work-intensive project, she's your person to partner with. And I want to thank her department and our colleague, Lisandro Perez. Lisandro's still here, right? Lisandro? No? Okay. Latin American and Latino studies have been such great friends to us. We're a little bit crazy in the Institute, as Ricardo Fernandez, our president, put it very kindly. It's a little bit cuckoo the way that we actually do try to encompass the 5 boroughs of CUNY, the 24 campuses. Sometimes it keeps us running, it keeps us challenged, but we're so delighted to be here with this beautiful room, this beautiful space, and most importantly, the beautiful colleagues and students and administrators here, like Dr. Carpi and Dr. Travis, who have really opened their arms to us and their resources to make this happen today. Today also wouldn't be possible without, we're a slim staff and team, but we are a team, and we have my associate director, Leslie Martino Velez. We have the ladies that are out in front. We have Alma Nazario and Marlene Fernandez, Victor Pajarito, and the John Jay volunteers, Elizabeth Calixto, who's in the doorway with your Eventbrite, and Shareni Diaz, who's been helping us. And so we have a lot of volunteers that have been helping all week, and actually for months. And we have our board. If you're on our board, raise your hand. We have our board members who are here, who are so supportive. And I just want to, Jesus already did this, but I just want to reiterate the importance of your support for us. For me, this is crucial and important, but for me, if I had to pick one thing that we do that we can't ever stop doing, it's our scholarship program. Our scholarship program, the CUNY y Becas program, was begun with funding from the Mexican federal government, but it is our job to match that funding. And with that funding, we have been able to fund 13 full tuition scholarships for CUNY students this academic year. We just selected 13 new full tuition scholarship recipients for the coming year. And every single one of those scholarship recipients is placed in a community service organization in New York City. They are the future, they are already, many of them, leaders in their communities. They are going to continue to be leaders. Some of them, because of financial need and working to pay for school, haven't been able to do an internship before. But they've had amazing academic achievements, faced incredible financial hardship. Others are already community leaders who've begun their own organizations amidst financial hardship and amidst their academic objectives. And so these students are incredible. If you were on the committee with us, you would be with your tissue box just like we were, crying over the incredible stories and the incredible achievements of these students. And so I just wanted to alert you that we have some more information about the program in this brochure. And I just want to tell you, personally how important the program is to us and how much we are looking for support. And we also love the program because of the way it allows us to partner with community-based organizations. So there are organizations in this room and outside that we work with. And so if you're in an organization, you can't provide support to the scholarship fund, but you can host a student, you can also speak to us about that. I just also, a little bit of housekeeping, want to make a couple of announcements. One is one of our programs, partners, Tertulia Resolana, is a program for Latino and Latin American studies. And the program is headed by Gabriel Higuera, who's just outside, I think, unless Gabriel came in. And on June 21st at Lehman College, we're having the inaugural high school student symposium. Nobody usually asks high school students to do research, or much less to present it. But we think it's important. We think it's an important thing for students to have the experience of doing research and presenting research. And so there's flyers outside if you have high school students in your life, if you're affiliated with a high school. Please reach out to us and to Gabriel to get students involved. We're very involved in the mentoring process to get them ready to present. Today, we have a long day. We're going to feed you. We're going to stimulate your mind. But we also wanted to let you know about, if you would like to stay here until after dark, we'll keep you busy. We have, after the formal panels, we have the CUNY y Becas Scholarship Award Ceremony at 5 o'clock. So I would like to invite you to be a part of that. I'm just reconfirming that it's 5. Yes, 5. The Consul General of Mexico will be giving the scholarship certificates at that moment. You'll be able to see and meet some of the scholarship award winners. And then at 6 o'clock, today is Mother's Day. Feliz Dia de la Madre in Mexico. And so we're going to celebrate with the story of a mother, of Elvira Arellano, and her incredible story with a documentary at 5:45 tonight down on the first floor in L76. Finally, I just wanted to alert you that this brochure has a lot of information, but it doesn't have the full bios of all of our presenters. So I encourage you to look at our website for their full biographical information. And I also just wanted to acknowledge the artist Felipe Galindo, who's in the audience, who made the beautiful artwork and brochure for us. So, and finally, I just wanted to, by way of transition, and we're starting the next panel, I just wanted to thank the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at the Graduate Center, which has been a partner. My colleague Laird Burgad has been such an engine behind a lot of the proposal process for the Institute, and has worked with us to produce the amazing report and has so generously provided it to everyone. So if you didn't get a chance to pick up the report when you came in, make sure that you get it before you go. And now we will transition into the first panel. So Rob, are you, there you are. If you want to take over from there. Thank you so much for being here.
So I have the easiest job. I will attempt to be gracious, as Alicia promised. he didn't say I would be technically savvy, but anyway, this is a very interesting panel, and it comes at the issues of Mexican migration to New York and other places from several different angles. We have a historian, Judy Leninger PCR from Manhattan College, who takes a very long view before 1970. Laird Bergat, who is our resident demographer, who's looking at some trends over the last 10 years. Leticia Calderon-Chelias, who has done a great deal of work on transnational and political and voting work in Mexico, a lot of which I've read, and Sergio Cortez Sanchez, who is our resident BWAP demographer, who is looking at the demography at the other end. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the torch. We'll go in the order on the thing. You want to go first, Laird?
Thank you very much. This is my presentation now is going to be a very brief version of a very long report that I circulated hard copies when you came in, and this will be posted on the internet website for downloading at the Center for Latin American Caribbean Latino Studies sometime by next week. So let me begin because we don't have very much time. I think I have about 15 minutes. The area studied in this report is the metropolitan region, for the simple reason that according to the 2010 census, about 45% of the Mexican origin population in the region lives outside of New York City. I think it makes much more sense to study the region as opposed to the city, and so this is the area encompassing this study here. In this region, we can see the extraordinary increase in population from 1990 to 2010. These numbers should not be cited. This is what the census data reveals. These are indicators of population growth. Well, the big question mark here is the number of undocumented people that fell through the census counters' hands. I would estimate conservatively that these numbers can be inflated by about 10 to 15%. No one will ever know for sure about this. The population in this tri-state region increased because of extraordinarily high birth rates among Mexican women, which we'll talk about momentarily. Large-scale migration after 1990. Here we have a table. You don't have to memorize the statistics. I always say that indicates the general fertility rates and crude birth rates among Mexicans. In comparative perspective, you can see very clearly that Mexicans have birth rates and fertility rates that are extraordinarily higher than any of the other major Latino national subgroups in the region. I will say, however, that these fertility rates have declined significantly since 1990, and I'm in fact authoring a study at this very moment, I'm writing it, about declines in fertility rates among Latino national subgroups. I think if we project to the future, these fertility rates will fall, as is the case with most immigrants who adopt the birth control practices of the host country. We can see here migration by decade. These are the numbers of foreign-born Mexicans living in the region here. You can see that after 1990, about 250,000 people arrived of Mexican origin in the area here. So you can see how meteorically immigration soared after 1980, but really it's after 1990 that the numbers increase in impressive dimensions here. Now, these are some projections. These are hypothetical. There are absolutely no guarantees that that this rate of population increase will continue into the future. But if it would, Mexicans will surpass every other Latino nationality in the tri-state region sometime in the decade of the 2020s. Again, if there are falling fertility rates, and there are some indicators that migration has fallen off as well, this will not hold true. But based on current data, this is what we can project into the future. Every single social and economic indicator here among Mexicans has been shaped by these two factors. Every single one. If without taking into account large-scale migration, we can't understand anything about the socioeconomic performance of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the tri-state region. So, Mexicans have the absolutely youngest population of all Latino nationalities with a median age of 25. There are extraordinarily large numbers of children because of the high fertility rates, 14 years of age and under. 65% of all domestic-born Mexicans in the region are under 15 years of age. That's two-thirds of every domestic-born person's under two-thirds of age. We'll see why that's going to be important in the future. We also find an extraordinary increase in households headed by women. And that is also going to play a very important role in understanding the socioeconomic performance of Mexicans, because women are more poorly paid compared to men. So you see here that in 2000, from 2000 to 2010, the increase in households headed by women is fairly impressive. Now nearly 40% of Mexican households are headed by women, and I think that that's going to increase in the future. Let's look at patterns of household income, which is a measure of socioeconomic performance here. Mexicans are the only Latino nationality in the region which experienced a decline in median household incomes. And this is in real terms, that is factored in for inflation. And this is because of what we just said, a large-scale increase in households headed by poorly educated, low-skill level foreign-born Mexicans because of the huge migration, an increase in households headed by women who earn less than men in labor markets. And however, I think we have to have a balanced view of household income. The news is not all bad. It was very skewed. There are large numbers of people earning less than $30,000, large numbers of households earning less than $30,000 annually, but a significant percentage of Mexican households earn more than $100,000 annually. This never makes a newspaper. It's all doom and gloom, and that's a distorted perspective. Here you see trends in household income. And again, this decline is real. And it's the only example. You compare Puerto Ricans, you compare Dominicans, you look at Ecuadorians, you look at Colombians. Those are the other four major groups. We find increases in household income because you don't have this large-scale migration after 1990. Now, you can see that the difference in households headed, in income earned by households headed by men and women. Female-headed households earn much less than male-headed households, and that's one of the reasons why you find this decline. Here we find the polarization in income distribution, and that's what I alluded to before. And you can see the Mexicans in comparative perspective. Again, a very large number of households can be considered poor because they earn less than $30,000 a year, but it is instructive to note that nearly a quarter of all Mexican households earn more than $100,000 a year in the tri-state area. That should not be ignored. There is a social structure. There is a class structure. All Mexicans cannot be considered to be homogeneous and equal from a class perspective. Let's look at poverty. It must be understood in the context of this massive migration after 1990. And this is especially true when age-specific poverty rates are examined, and especially what is going to be demonstrated here graphically is the high levels of childhood poverty that we find in Mexican communities. Notice that, now look at this chart very carefully. This shows people falling into the levels of poverty by age groups. Notice that young people have the highest rates of poverty of any of the other age groups here, and that poverty rates decline with age. As we move into the core working ages, poverty rates are lower. As we move into the 45 to 59 and over 60 category, poverty rates are much, much lower than they are for young people. Why is that? This is why. I said before at the beginning of this presentation that 65% of all Mexicans born in the United States are under 14 years of age. They're born mostly to foreign-born parents. Again, low skill sets, low educational attainment profiles. Notice that as Mexican age, poverty rates decline. And this is important to note if we're going to project toward the future. This poverty is not a permanent situation. We're living in a society where change is the essence of what occurs here. I hate to be overly optimistic, but I can't help myself here. I don't think that the doom and gloom scenarios that we read so often really capture the essence of change over time. There's evidence not only these age-specific poverty rates are going to decline in the future. But let's look at something that's very esoteric. This is personal income by time of arrival. What it shows here, look at the trend line in red. If you arrived more recently, you earn less money. If you've been here for a longer period of time, you earn more money. What's that mean for the future? It means that people who have been here, who are arrived in 2000, have a high probability of earning more by 2020 than did in 2010. So income trends verify exactly what I was alluding to before. That is, we must have a dynamic view of change. All right, educational attainment. Non-high school graduation rate, unfortunately, rose precisely because of this large-scale migration. And the college graduation rate among all Mexicans over the age of 25 dropped. This is the only Latino national subgroup where we find this to be the case. All right? And this is entirely the way, is linked to the way data are measured. The educational attainment is measured for the population 25 years of age. 85% of these people in the Mexican tri-state area were immigrants or foreign-born Mexicans. Okay. Don't memorize this data. It just shows what indicates what I showed you before. Read the report. You have a hard copy of this. What it shows is what I just said. High school graduation rates have declined. College graduation have increased. Non-high school graduation rates have increased. College graduation rates have declined. This is part of the story. Here is the real story. The difference between domestic and foreign-born Mexicans. I didn't bring my glasses here, but what you can see here is that among foreign-born Mexicans, there is an extraordinarily high rate of people who don't graduate high school. But look at it. That's the left chart here. Let's see if this works. These data here. But look among domestic-born Mexicans. Among domestic-born Mexicans, the non-high school graduation rate is extraordinarily low. Look at college graduation rates. Among domestic-born Mexicans, 45% of all women graduated college with a BA degree. All right. The problem here is that the predominance of the foreign-born skew the overall data toward poor performance levels, and 35% of men. Look at the foreign-born Mexicans, very low college graduation rates. So data is very tricky. How do you analyze it? What do you examine? Do you look at the overall data and weep tears, or do you say, look, change is going to occur in the future, especially among this domestic-born population, or at least we hope that's the case. All right, school attendance. This is very germane because of a recent report released by the released and cited in the New York Times, which we'll talk about in a moment. Mexican children go to school. Mexican mothers and fathers make sure their children are enrolled in school. Attendance is over 95% when we look at the school-age population between 5 and 18. Why is this important to take note of? The Community Service Society recently published a report which was widely cited in the media, and quite frankly, and quite to the point, all of their data was erroneous because of the way in which they analyzed the data. They looked at school-age population by examining Mexicans between the ages of 16 and 24 years of age, which is utterly absurd, and arrived at the extraordinary conclusion that only 37% of Mexican youth were in school. What kind of image does that project to the public about the Mexican and Mexican-American population in the region? 37% of Mexican youth are enrolled in school. Sure, look at 16 to 24-year-olds. The fact of the matter is that most 16 to 24-year-olds were migrants who arrived after 1990, did not come here to enroll in school, but came here to work. Youth not in school, untrue. The unfortunate thing here is not that these researchers who analyzed and published the data were mistaken, and again, this is a kind comment, which I think you can deduce from the tone of my discourse here. The real problem is the image that is created. Why is there anti-Latino anti-immigrant sentiment in some sectors of the United States population. Maybe it's because that the factual information that people digest when they read reports such as this are completely wrong. If you read this report, one of your Mexicans are mired in poverty, young people are mired in poverty, and Mexican mothers and fathers don't send their children to school, and so this poverty is going to be endemic and perpetuated in the future. The fact of the matter is, this is exaggerated, it's untrue, and it's lamentable. I wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times which reported extensively on this report that the CSS released. They refused to publish it. The corrective is here. I thank you all very much for your patience. There's a lot of data in this report. If you have not received a hard copy, it may be downloaded from my center's website sometime next week when I hope to be able to post it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bueno, primero que nada, muchas gracias por la invitación. Yo voy a leer mi texto. Muchas gracias, Alicia. Muchas gracias a todo el equipo que hizo posible esta visita aquí a la ciudad de Nueva York. Y bueno, realmente yo, obedeciendo a la convocatoria que tenía que ver con discutir 30 años del estudio de la migración, titulé mi ponencia 30 años de estudiar la migración, los nuevos imaginarios pensados. Siempre me gustó bailar salsa. Pero qué mejor que hacerlo al ritmo de la música que hablaba de esos temas que me conmovían hasta el tuétano cuando era una joven estudiante y apenas me iniciaba en los estudios de migración. Usa la conciencia, latino, no la dejes que se duerma, no la dejes que muera. Cantaba Willy Colón y Rubén Blades y nosotros, los de entonces, bailábamos hasta la última nota. Pero la referencia musical no solo era el pretexto para bailar. A muchos nos remitía de inmediato a pensar en todo aquello que le ocurría a los mexicanos en Estados Unidos, los cuales conformaban una comunidad creciente y sostenida por la inmigración que de manera histórica se había iniciado desde finales del siglo XIX. Lo que se estudiaba sobre la migración en ese entonces, en México, finales de los años 80, es lo que creíamos le ocurría a la comunidad mexicana en este país. Así, saber cómo vivían, cómo se integraban, por qué eran excluidos, eran los ejes centrales para su estudio. A decir de los libros que se habían producido a lo largo del siglo XX, al estudiar la migración, la Academia estadounidense ponía el énfasis en entender la incapacidad o éxito de cada grupo étnico para asimilarse y ser parte del crisol cultural o melting pot. Teoría que hoy nos suena desfasada, pero que prevaleció como eje de explicación del comportamiento de las comunidades de inmigrantes durante décadas. En el caso de los mexicanos, esta teoría pretendía revelar muchas de las incógnitas de los altos niveles de segregación que el grupo presentaba, arguyendo que las respuestas estaban en los valores ancestrales y su cultura política que generaba conductas inadecuadas respecto al modelo cívico prevaleciente en Estados Unidos. Bajo este esquema se desarrollaron los estudios migratorios de esta y todas las comunidades de extranjeros en Estados Unidos a lo largo de buena parte del siglo pasado. Lo interesante es cómo empezaron a surgir alternativas que ofrecían otras interpretaciones y que en el fondo constituían expresiones de resistencia intelectual que, como decíamos entonces, se desarrollaban desde las entrañas del imperio. Me refiero a que en ese momento el movimiento chicano empezaba a graduar ya un número importante de doctores en diversas áreas de las ciencias sociales y humanidades, quienes sostenían versiones alternativas sobre su propia historia como minoría marginal y segregada. Producto de este proceso hay un libro maravilloso que a mí me marcó profundamente, Familias chicanas en el sureste de Norteamérica, de 1848 al presente, de Richard Griswold del Castillo, donde hablaba de este proceso histórico principalmente ubicado en los inicios del siglo XX, dando una explicación profundamente sociológica, la cual revertía todos los lugares comunes y las imprecisiones históricas para entender a esos mexicanos radicados en Estados Unidos que se describían en textos clásicos de entonces. En su libro, Griswold del Castillo explicaba el peso de las alianzas matrimoniales entre los mexicanos y las razones para la baja opción por matrimonios mixtos, el lugar atribuido a la mujer y su papel asignado al interior del grupo familiar, el lugar social de los niños y el papel de estos niños en la reproducción del propio grupo, el valor de la familia extensa en el siglo XIX, que otorgaba, y aún ahora lo hace, Importancia fundamental al primo, cuñado, padrino o comadre, que nunca puede faltar en una reunión familiar, pero sobre todo, y por encima de todo, en el imaginario del grupo, que solo así, en la extensión familiar, puede sentirse completo. Por eso, aún con nuestras patologías, el núcleo familiar sigue constituyendo el eje de la sociedad mexicana. Dentro de esta etapa de producción académica básicamente de mexicoamericanos que comenzaban a conformar una masa crítica de alto nivel que reinterpretaba la propia historia que les había sido asignada y que si antes los describía como los bandidos, los revoltosos, los rebeldes, los renegados, con su aportación empezaron a revertir el estigma y el prejuicio que son los ingredientes que justificaron social y jurídicamente la marginación y pobreza estructural de todo el grupo que compone a la comunidad mexicana en Estados Unidos y que los ubica en un círculo imposible de romper. En esta saga incluye una lectura espléndida en la narración de David Montejano, Anglos y Mexicanos en la Formación de Texas, del 36 al 86 del siglo pasado, que tuvo a bien publicar en México, traducido al español, en 1991, el Conaculta. Este trabajo ofrece un ejemplo del ímpetu analítico sobre los mexicanos en Estados Unidos, que en su inmensa mayoría los analistas se referían a los chicanos. Así, lo que estudiábamos de la migración era la participación política de esa minoría con sus múltiples formas y procesos, la organización sindical, sus huelgas, sus luchas por el reconocimiento cultural, su defensa por la educación bilingüe, los grandes momentos de resistencia a la segregación y a favor de la acción afirmativa. Además, obviamente, los movimientos agrícolas de gran prestigio, cuyos líderes siguen siendo íconos de la comunidad latina, como ocurre, por dar un solo nombre, el de César Chávez, que su sola mención evoca toda una época. Obviamente, hubo grandes analistas del proceso migratorio no solo basado en los chicanos, muchos de los cuales se produjeron mucho antes del periodo que estoy relatando. El más reconocido y multicitado en México es Manuel Gamio, a quien Saúl Alanís del Colegio de San Luis define como el iniciador de las investigaciones sobre la inmigración mexicana a los Estados Unidos, cuando desde los años 30 describió y analizó de manera detallada las trayectorias migratorias de los trabajadores mexicanos que venían a Estados Unidos. Con la narrativa de esas trayectorias se reconstruyó todo un proceso fundacional de la comunidad mexicana en Estados Unidos, su procedencia, su origen laboral, sus sueños, sus futuros entre países. Otra perspectiva importante en las líneas analíticas con las que se inició el estudio de la migración en México se dio con la inclusión de los estudios que hizo el doctor Jorge Bustamantes, quien en sus años estudiantiles, años 70, clavó la mirada no en las comunidades de migrantes en Estados Unidos, sino en el flujo, el camino, el cruce, es decir, el clímax de la odisea del viaje migratorio. No en el antes, no en el después, sino en el momento preciso de cruzar. Con este interés como eje surgieron los estudios fronterizos en México, donde el acento en el cruce mismo se volvió el sello de la casa. Sobra decir que el doctor Bustamante fundó y dirigió el Centro de Estudios Fronterizos y Migratorios más importantes de México, ubicado a lo largo de la frontera norte de la nación azteca, primero CEFNOMEX en 1982 y desde 1986 hasta 1998 como COLEF, años en que fue presidente de esa institución y fue relevado en el 98. Si bien el énfasis en los estudios fronterizos sigue siendo eje de sus reflexiones y aportes científicas, como todos saben hoy en día, el COLEF está altamente diversificado en sus propias propuestas analíticas. La consolidación numérica de la comunidad mexicana en Estados Unidos en los años 80, el debate legislativo hacia una reforma migratoria que arrancó en 1982 con la propuesta Simpson-Mazzoli y posteriormente la aprobación de la ley Simpson-Rodino en el 86, también produjeron una serie de estudios y análisis que buscaban entender el debate político que se libraba acá, en Estados Unidos, donde lo que pretendía era entender las consecuencias que dicha reforma migratoria tendría para los mexicanos radicados en el vecino país del norte. Nuevamente, e insisto, lo que era de interés en esos años era, sobre todo, estudiar a los mexicanos en Estados Unidos. Sobra decir que con casi 3 millones de mexicanos que se documentaron en ese periodo, 1986, los rodinos, como se les llamó coloquialmente, cambiaron dramáticamente la experiencia migratoria mexicana, ya que se incrementó la circularidad entre ambos países y se reconfiguró un nuevo flujo que es la base de la comunidad mexicana actual y la que será impactada por la posible reforma migratoria hoy en debate, como ustedes mismos saben. Pero volvamos a la trayectoria de los estudios migratorios como si siguiéramos en el túnel del tiempo. En esos años 80, mientras se discutía la experiencia de los mexicanos en Estados Unidos o su cruce fronterizo, de manera circular y a grandes brincos, se estaban desarrollando nuevas líneas de estudio que se volvieron pioneras en lo que sería tendencia a los pocos años de postularse. Un texto central para el giro que tuvieron los estudios de lo migratorio en México e incluso de la propia comprensión más amplia del proceso mismo fue el libro Los ausentes, el proceso social de migración internacional de México en el occidente de 1991, que bajo el equipo del Mexican Project, el libro coeditado y hecho por Douglas Massey, Jorge Durán, Rafael Alarcón y Humberto González, marcó una nueva ruta en los estudios migratorios. Esta investigación aportó un punto que es fundamental para entender el estudio de la migración mexicana, pues indagaba en el impacto que la migración provoca en las comunidades de origen de los migrantes. Exploraba lo que, por otro lado, Gustavo López Castro, 1986, describió en su libro La casa dividida como el solar de los aburridos. Esto es, la situación de esas comunidades de origen de los que emigran, las comunidades espejos de los que constituyen la diáspora mexicana acá en Estados Unidos. Supongo que más de uno en esta sala no verá la novedad de este aporte. Claro, porque la mayoría hemos crecido entre algodones en el estudio de lo migratorio. Pero justamente lo que me interesa es que vean el giro entre el estudio del universo social mexicanos en Estados Unidos y la relevancia que tiene la incorporación de la otra parte de este análisis que nunca, hasta entonces, se había considerado relevante, la comunidad de origen. Los migrantes se iban y punto. En todo caso volvían y algunos viajaban nuevamente, pero el impacto que eso ha tenido para sus comunidades, sus familias, para ellos mismos, no se estudiaba hasta hace menos de 20 años que en ciencias sociales, es decir, casi ayer. En paralelo a esta propuesta, en el ámbito más amplio, se iniciaba el boom de los estudios que tienen como eje la propuesta del transnacionalismo, para todos conocida, que precisamente estudia el vínculo que los migrantes mantienen con sus comunidades de origen a nivel social, comercial, económico, cultural, político, religioso, etc. Es decir, es el reconocimiento a una intensidad y vínculo del proceso migratorio que no había sido visto antes, o por lo menos no en esa dimensión, lo que nos obligó a ver sus múltiples territorios, espacios, conexiones simbólicas y tan pragmáticas como la posibilidad de enviar flores el 10 de mayo, Día de la Madre en México, desde Nueva York a la Ciudad de México o a la que se les ocurra. Esta vertiente renovó el campo de los estudios migratorios a un nivel insospechado. Visibilizó procesos que se gestaban desde hacía tiempo, como la religiosidad transnacionalizada, el comercio de la nostalgia, o la reproducción cultural a través de prácticas imaginativas que es posible leer en la infinidad de estudios que sobre este campo se han realizado. Sobra decir que uno de los temas más estudiados y de mayor impacto por el potencial económico que representa y sobre el cual descansa una cantidad considerable de supuestos es el de las remesas, prueba irrefutable y constante en pesos y centavos del vínculo que los migrantes mantienen con sus comunidades de origen y sus familias. De este tema podríamos hablar mucho, pero sirva de ejemplo para mostrar el boom que iniciaba a partir de un nuevo paradigma en los estudios de la migración que se empezó a dar a inicios de la década de los años 90 en México. Estudiar la migración desde México. Los años 90 cerrarían el siglo XX y ante la perspectiva de estudiar lo migratorio como un proceso flexible, móvil, dinámico, fragmentado en varias partes, si nos atenemos al transnacionalismo, se abrió un reto para la otrora jóvenes estudiantes que en ese entonces planteábamos nuestras primeras y temerarias hipótesis. Me parece que en ese marco y a partir de lo que he relatado en estas líneas, es donde se da un proceso académico muy importante para la comprensión del proceso migratorio desde los países de origen. Y no me refiero a la geografía o la nacionalidad per se, sino al enfoque teórico que se abrió como preocupación explicativa. ¿Cómo impacta la migración a los que se quedan? A los que viven vinculados a los sueños, a quienes viven en otra geografía, los que siguen andando pese a la ausencia? Las puras estadísticas no nos ayudaban a ver la magnitud de este proceso y fue en ese marco analítico que se abrieron nuevas líneas de estudio que impactaron por su frescura y dinamismo. Era como una especie de subversión epistemológica que no tenía que ver con la versión localista ni mucho menos con el nacionalismo metodológico, pero que sin embargo refrendaba, sin decirlo, una hechura local o una necesidad de ver lo que pasaba ahí mismo frente a nuestros ojos. la nueva era de la migración, anunciada en los 90, se pobló entonces de nuevos sujetos de estudio que hasta ese entonces apenas algunos habían hecho notar. Mujeres, indígenas, Kearney, Besserer, Smith, y que me honra además que de estar con varios de ustedes, y más recientemente, mucho más recientemente, jóvenes, niños. A los sujetos se sumaron los temas, los problemas, las preguntas que diferenciaban una generación de la otra. ¿Qué tanto participan los que denominamos nuevos sujetos sociales en el flujo migratorio? ¿Son sus experiencias migratorias diferentes a lo que por años llamamos patrón tradicional de la migración? ¿Cómo juega el rol de género en la construcción de las comunidades transnacionales? Pero el componente que más destaca de estos nuevos sujetos sociales para el campo de la migración era la lectura que podíamos dar ya no desde el vínculo exclusivo que el transnacionalismo sugería, sino algo aún más trascendente: analizar el impacto inminente que el proceso tenía sobre nuestras propias sociedades. Lo que creo que nos pasó fue una especie de necesidad de ver nuestro propio ombligo. ¿Y qué pasó en México? Y luego, al mismo tiempo, en cascada, fue ocurriendo en todos los países donde sé, por lo menos yo, que se estudia la migración en América Latina. Brasil, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Perú, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, Centroamérica. Y sigan mencionando la geografía del continente que me haya faltado. Ese proceso de incorporar nuestra propia parte en el proceso migratorio se sumó al debate de las ciencias sociales en cada uno de estos países de manera relativamente reciente en términos de las ciencias sociales. Dado este escenario, podemos decir que a mediados de los años 90 se abrió un campo moderno en los estudios de lo migratorio en América Latina, el cual exponía desde su propia intuición científica y se desmarcaba de la referencia obligada de citar siempre lo publicado en Estados Unidos. Que es todo un tema en México, en América Latina en general, y voltear a vernos a nosotros mismos. Mientras que al mismo tiempo y paradójicamente, en cada nueva producción temática o conceptual, nos asumíamos más que nunca como parte de un debate universal y cosmopolita en el que el proceso migratorio y sus múltiples consecuencias en un mundo interconectado y entrelazado se volvió nuestro marco de explicación fundamental. Esto abrió un sinnúmero de temas que ustedes ya escuchan como repetidos, pero los cuales hace relativamente poco tiempo fueron verdaderas aportaciones a un campo de estudio que simplemente floreció y que hoy se vive con gran auge. ¿Qué creo yo que pasó? Voy a hablar de lo que toca a México solamente, pero creo que en cada caso latinoamericano hay un camino semejante con sus particulares bien locales. Voy a saltar esta parte para que me dé tiempo. Creo yo que fue en el proceso de la transición política donde se explican muchas de las cuestiones que tienen que ver con cómo se empezó a estudiar la migración, sobre todo en el caso mexicano, y que tiene que ver con que el país se diversificó, el país se abrió a las minorías, a las diversidades, y el tema de la migración, explico yo acá en el texto, cambió de la percepción que se tenía de estos que se habían ido a incluso la exageración de nombrarlos superhéroes, ¿no? Pues bien, es exactamente en este contexto que cambiaron los lentes analíticos con los que se había visto el proceso migratorio y lo que explica, en mi opinión, el que nos abriéramos a temas que antes simplemente no eran temas y que empezaron a poblar nuestro vocabulario de lo migratorio. Comunidades semiabandonados, Penélopes modernas y reinventando la Odisea, niños al cuidado de abuelos, el impacto de la ausencia y la presencia posible, aquí citando a Smith. La diversificación de quienes emigraban, la inclusión de la travesía al norte en comunidades que nunca antes habían tenido experiencia migratoria internacional, etcétera. Es en este escenario que, por ejemplo, en el campo de lo político, los migrantes dejaron de ser una referencia nostálgica del discurso oficial y hablo yo brevemente del tema que es lo que más trabajo yo y que tiene que ver con la inclusión política. Voy a cerrar con esto. El siglo XXI se volvió migrante. He hecho este recorrido para ubicar a la migración y su estudio en el marco de la transición mexicana, no solo política, sino tal vez y con más fuerza, una transición demográfica, ya se mencionaba incluso acá, cultural y societal. Sin este escenario de base no se puede entender lo migratorio en México ni cómo se estudia este proceso actualmente. El cambio ha sido mayúsculo. Los migrantes mexicanos, otrora envilecidos en el discurso jacarandoso del cine nacional de los años 50, como los pochos, pasaron a ser los renegados y ausentes de los años 70 y de ahí se volvieron héroes por obra y gracia divina de quien fuera nuestro presidente. No entro en detalles, pero esto tiene que ver con un proceso mucho más amplio, con la natalidad relativamente baja, bueno, que va a baja, y una serie de elementos que están ahí en la explicación del tema de cómo se ve y se estudia la migración desde México. Prácticamente para concluir. Así pues, lo que yo creo es que para entender el estudio de la migración en México hay que vincularlo fuertemente a los procesos sociopolíticos contemporáneos y nunca verlo de manera aislada, ajena como un proceso que ocurre de manera independiente a la propia dinámica de su país y el de destino. Por eso, dado que pasamos de una euforia de un periodo al otro, creo que por eso podríamos entender los nuevos y emergentes temas de la migración, porque aunque se anunció en la época de Calderón una desmigratización del tema, en realidad lo que vimos es un creciente y diverso fenómeno migratorio. Y por eso, muchos de los temas que hoy se estudian en México tienen que ver con, por ejemplo, la trata de personas, de creciente preocupación en el país, el exilio, el asilo, el refugio, el desplazamiento interno y el transfronterizo por violencia y por miedo. El impacto emocional y las consecuencias que la ausencia provoca, no solo en el ámbito de los sentimientos, sino a nivel médico, escolar, de integración, con un fuerte impacto económico que finalmente el propio Estado tiene que revertir y pagar por las consecuencias de lo que hemos vivido. Así, por ejemplo, la migración de retorno, que era una experiencia desconocida en México, salvo casos aislados, se ha vuelto uno de los temas centrales del debate en el campo de los estudios de lo migratorio. ¿Qué hacemos con miles que regresan? Este es hoy uno de los temas fundamentales que se estudia en el país. O un tema que lastima como pocos, como es el caso de la separación de familias por deportación, que ha ocurrido en números crecientes. Ya, me falta nada. Stop, me dicen. Y yo que me esmeré en escribir esto. Bueno, los años más recientes de la geografía, y sí quisiera decir esto, porque tiene que ver con que mucho de lo que hoy se trabaja en México en temas de la migración tiene que ver y está fuertemente vinculado al tema de la violencia y, por tanto, bueno, ahí es donde estamos poniendo mucho el interés y que tal vez puede contribuir y servir para que se entienda también cómo se puede estudiar a las comunidades desde este lado. Quiero cerrar esta plática, before I stop, comentándoles un cambio cualitativo que los estudios de la migración en México han tenido de manera relativamente reciente y que les permitirán entender mejor este largo recorrido. Se trata de la capacidad de incluir dentro del propio espectro de lo estrictamente migratorio, si es que eso existe, tantos otros procesos que derivan, se entrelazan e incluso son generados por la misma migración. Temas como la diversidad cultural, la tolerancia, el reconocimiento de los derechos humanos, más allá de geografías, los derechos políticos, son un segmento potente y provocador de lo que se estudia en México como parte de lo migratorio y desde ahí se puede ubicar la reciente intensidad del análisis sobre el marco legal, que es una cosa que se estudia mucho y aquí hay varios que son expertos en eso, y las investigaciones históricas contemporáneas. Tomen en cuenta que menos del 1% de la población en México está compuesta de extranjeros. Muchos entendemos que en su comprensión, la del otro lado, la del extraño, el extranjero, en el reconocimiento de su historia, el seguimiento a su presencia y en visibilizar su aporte a la sociedad mexicana, se encuentra el espejo donde podremos ver, como el espejo de la bruja mala de Blancanieves, la parte más hermosa de nosotros mismos, pero también, y da horror y miedo asomarse a ese espejo que vemos en todas sociedades existe, la parte más cruel, ignorante, racista, xenofóbica y patriotera de nosotros mismos. Solo enfrentándola podremos cambiarla. México transita en ese tema. Bueno, finalmente, muchas gracias y les agradezco.
El tema que me tocó a mí es sobre unas valoraciones del impacto que ha tenido la contracción de los flujos migratorios en el estado de Puebla, que es donde yo me ubico. La fuente de estos datos son del lado oficial de México, CONAPO, estimaciones de flujos migratorios, el INEGI, su conteo de población y vivienda, el 95, 2005 de conteo de población, y los de censos de población y vivienda 2000 y 2010. Y para migración, nuestra fuente oficial es CONAPO también, la que elabora un índice de densidad migratoria, y esa es la base de los datos que vamos a presentar. Otra base que se refiere ya a 3 municipios. Esas son encuestas, son las encuestas que hacemos en un periódico. El periódico, cada mes hacemos una encuesta sobre migración. Al final del año tenemos 5,000, 6,000 casos y con esos 5,000, 6,000 casos hacemos algunas estimaciones anuales sobre flujos migratorios. Eso se hace únicamente para el municipio de Puebla. Bueno, esos son los datos que tenemos acá. Entonces, vamos a empezar aquí. Esto es por aquí. Bueno, Eso ya lo dije, ya lo dije, ya lo dije. Ya. Desde aquí para allá, yo creo que no hay problema como me pase para allá porque tengo un problema de ver oblicuo, tengo que ver de frente.
Se puede llevar el micrófono, ¿no?
Ah, gracias. Gracias. Pero tengo que ver los datos de frente porque traigo un multifocal, entonces de lado no me ajusto. Bueno, estos son los flujos, ¿sí? De allá para acá, medidos por dos diferentes instancias. El Pew Hispanic Center, que es lo que publicó en el año pasado el demógrafo Pacel, junto con De Vera y González, y el otro lado es CONAPO. Coincidimos en cuanto a la bajada, nada más. Después hay estimaciones. Por ejemplo, el Pew Hispanic Center dice que 400,000 niños que se acompañaron a sus padres de retorno, ellos los clasifican como retornados, entonces pues, no puede retornar a alguien que nunca se fue. Entonces ahí empiezan los problemas. Pero en fin, coincidimos, bajamos ambos, eso no hay duda, ¿sí? Estamos en un proceso de migración cero, neto, los saldos netos. Entonces, por dos procesos ha bajado el flujo y ha aumentado la deportación. Aquí únicamente hay flujos, los flujos han bajado. La base de CONAPO es una encuesta demográfica que se hace en México cada 2 años, y otra que se hace en la frontera norte, esa es permanente. En el caso del Pew Hispanic Center es una encuesta mensual de marzo, ahí está señalada. Bueno, ha bajado, no hay duda, ¿sí? Ha bajado la migración. Bueno, esto es ya el stock, ¿sí? Lo que nosotros hemos dicho, bueno, aquí está nada más en los últimos años, no hay problema, después de 2007 hacia acá, estamos estables. 12 millones aproximadamente de mexicanos que nacieron en México y están trabajando aquí, con una herencia que les dejamos de 11 millones de hijos y 10 millones de nietos, segunda y tercera generación. Entonces, ahí estamos ubicados. Más o menos, aquí no hay problema porque la fuente es la misma. El estimador, el que hace la estimación es el que cambia, pero la fuente es la misma, estables de 97 al 2010. Bueno, esta es ya entonces yo soy economista y entonces siempre intento asociar más a lo económico, pero no nada más yo, los sociólogos, antropólogos y economistas también están enfocando que las personas que vienen de México hacia acá no son apátridas, no son personas que vienen huyendo de sus cosmovisiones, sus tradiciones. La mayoría de ellos viene a buscar trabajo, casi todos ellos. En todas las encuestas que hay en la frontera norte, 80% del flujo tenía trabajo en México previo a emigrar. Se vino para acá porque las condiciones de vida que tiene allá son diferentes a las que puede tener acá. Hay un problema de expectativas de vida que allá no lograría concretar. De 2007 para acá se nos complicó la vida en los mercados laborales. 600,000 personas fueron desempleadas básicamente en la construcción y muchos mexicanos vienen a la construcción. Entonces, aquí están los datos. La tasa de desempleo para nosotros, los mexicanos en Estados Unidos, pasó casi al 11%. Se nos cayó la contratación. Bueno, ya esto es nuestro aporte, o el aporte que ha hecho México al sueño americano. Entre 1980 y 2010 aportamos 9 millones de personas, que es el flujo más fuerte que tenemos ahí indicado. Entonces, una población que teníamos antes de la apertura y de la firma del TLC, estábamos sobre 2.199.000 mexicanos residentes en Estados Unidos y ya en el 2005, que fue el pico, ya estábamos sobre 11 millones. Bueno, estas ya son fuentes nuestras, cómo medimos la migración por flujos quinquenales. En los últimos 5 años, alguien que vive en esta casa ha salido, y eso se hace el ENADIT, lo hace el INEGI cada 2 años, y ahí tenemos la migración neta cero. Eso se da a partir ya de los últimos 3 años. Esto llevó al entonces presidente Felipe Calderón a decir que se atropellaban por regresar porque las condiciones en México habían cambiado. Sí, lo que vamos a notar por ahí, que eso no tanto es así. Ya lo ha dicho también Ricardo Peña. Bueno, flujos quinquenales, ya es Puebla y también es fuente el INEGI, el CONAPO con datos del INEGI. Si vemos, también tenemos en un flujo favorable. Ya los que retornan son más de los que emigran. Y esto es el problema que decía Leticia. Bueno, ¿qué vamos a hacer? Porque Las proyecciones del censo, por ejemplo, para 2010, nosotros estimábamos que íbamos a tener 112 millones y llegaron 114, porque hay 2 millones que tenían que haber salido en 2007, 2008, 2009 y 10, pero ya no salieron. Entonces, al ser el denominador un poquito más grande, pues todos los indicadores de bienestar se nos empezaron a caer. Y no tan solo porque aumentó el denominador, sino porque las mismas condiciones nos cambiaron. Entonces, sí tenemos un problema con los dólares que ya no mandan y además están allá. Y allá no hay mucho trabajo. Esto es un cruce entre dos variables, lo que es índice de marginación y lo que es índice de intensidad migratoria. El índice de marginación es un índice de carencias, de lo que no se tiene, enfocado básicamente a calidad de vida, piso de la tierra, el techo, cuántos viven por cuarto, si hay agua entubada o no dentro de la casa, eso es marginación. Si vemos la intensidad migratoria no es sensible a condiciones extremas de marginación. Los muy pobres no están en el circuito. Por eso tenemos el municipio de Puebla y es por género mujeres más desempleadas que los hombres y los muchachos de 18 a 29 años mucho más desempleados que cualquier adulto. Tener un título, si a esa condición le agregan un título universitario, la posibilidad de que esté en desempleo es todavía más alta. Si a esa situación de ser mujer y joven le agregas un título de la universidad, la posibilidad de que sea desempleo es más alta. Es un poco, al rato tengo una gráfica por ahí donde dice los desempleados, de todos los desempleados, tienen el 45% de ellos tienen estudios de licenciatura. Bueno, tasa de desempleo por sexo ya es la general, ya no estamos en 14 como en otra, estamos en 8, ya es la tasa general. O sea, mucho más moderada que la tasa de los jóvenes que anunciamos antes. Bueno, somos una sociedad de cierta forma donde predominan los varones en el mercado laboral, las mujeres participan 4 de cada 10 y al revés los hombres, 6 de cada 10. Crecimiento del empleo, no tenemos un crecimiento constante. Todo el periodo 2000-2012 crecimos al 2% con muchos altibajos, ¿sí? Y eso que Puebla, la ciudad de Puebla, el municipio de Puebla, es la ciudad que tiene el crecimiento más alto de la entidad, la que genera la mayor parte del Producto Interno Bruto, es donde se genera el 40% de la masa salarial. Es el paraíso, es Puebla, pero aún así nosotros tenemos problemas. Esto es lo que decía, son los desempleados. ¿Qué estudio de licenciatura tienen? Es tasa de desempleo. Los ocupados, este es de ocupados mujeres y ocupados hombres con tasas de estudio de licenciatura de 51%, pero veamos los desocupados igual. O sea, los desocupados mujeres, desocupados hombres tienen la mayoría de ellos, la mitad de ellos o casi la mitad de ellos, estudios de licenciatura. O sea, toda esta teoría del capital humano, de que productividad, ingreso marginal, entramos a la escuela y tenemos trabajo, la movilidad social no se está cumpliendo. Allá tenemos 60,000 doctores, de grado de doctor, y aquí hay ya 15,000 de ellos. Se vinieron hacia acá. Bueno, ya hay stock. ¿Cuántos emigran en relación a la población? ¿Cómo estamos? Otra vez, una caída a partir de 2006, 2007, ¿sí? Bueno, esto es municipio de Puebla. Sigue siendo municipio de Puebla, la anterior era población, este es stock por familias. O sea, hay una de 7 familias tiene familiares acá. O sea, llegar acá se encuentra uno con un chiquito, que es un apellido muy común en el volcán, está el cerro, en Atlisco, en los alrededores. Primero fueron mixtecos, pero en los 90 se incorporaron fuertemente los migrantes de Atlisco, que son quizás el grupo más fuerte en Puebla, de Puebla que sale hacia acá. Finalmente, medido tasas de migración, los que salen entre la población, que tenemos otra caída a partir del año 2007. Bueno, aquí están todos los destinos nacionales, población que se va a otros estados de la República, los que se van al extranjero. Tenemos esta línea que es importante, que está acá, que son los que se van al extranjero, aparte de la colonia libanesa y española que tenemos una reubicación de la empresa transnacional. A partir de los años 80 tenemos una Volkswagen, ya tenemos una empresa Audi, y hay un tránsito de trabajadores entre filiales, quizás esté registrando acá, porque esas personas que migran tienen más de 30 años, los que están emigrando hacia países diferentes a Estados Unidos. Tenemos un flujo con Canadá, pero el Canadá son 22,000, 26,000, 22,000, no es muy alto. Bueno, ya aquí otra vez estamos, ¿para dónde se van? ¿Sí? Lo azul es Estados Unidos, lo verde, otros países, y como vemos, pues predomina lo azul. Más del 90% de nuestros flujos son hacia Estados Unidos, y en particular los que estamos en Puebla vienen Nueva York, ese es el destino. El municipio de Puebla, ya termina. Gracias, Robert. Bueno, entonces los datos van por ahí, ya hogares que reciben otra vez la crisis, se nos cayó la percepción de ingresos por familia. Bueno, estos son los estudios donde fuimos, nomás tengo 2 municipios, están en el norte, son cafetaleros, hubo una crisis del café en los años 80, había un convenio que regulaba el comercio, Estados Unidos ya no quiso formar el comercio, dijo que tratos bilaterales, nos propuso un tratado comercial y el café, los precios empezaron a caer y a las localidades de la Sierra Norte que sembraban café le fue bastante mal y a partir de los años 90 tenemos una migración étnica, cosa que no estaba presente, que el 2000 se calculó en 5%. Entonces, hay 2 trabajos, uno que está del lado, en la Sierra Norte, que es arriba y a la izquierda. Ahí están los municipios de Pahuatlán y el otro que es de Huauchinango y en el sur. La mayoría de los migrantes son de esta zona, la 5 y la 6, que es Mixteca. Tasas de esos municipios, todas las tasas en esos municipios se nos cayeron. Pahuatlán es un pueblito de 4,000 familias, casi de domicilio conocido, tiene 1 de cada 10 hogares recibe dólares, están acá los pahuatlecos. Pero también está en Huauchinango, también está el área metropolitana de la ciudad de Puebla y en todos los casos las tasas se nos cayeron. Bueno, el perfil de los migrantes, fuerza laboral, esto, salvo Estados Unidos, bueno, lo voy a pasar porque esto ya no tiene mucho caso. Hay circuitos, los de Pahuatlán van a Arizona, los de Huauchinango, no, de los de Huauchinango van a Arizona, los de Pahuatlán van a Carolina del Norte y los del municipio de Puebla están aquí en la Quinta Avenida, si vienen para acá, básicamente. Bueno, generalmente 7 de cada 10 envían dólares, básicamente, las familias, es una constante. Y es más fuerte donde hay más compromisos directos del emigrado con la familia, como es el caso de Pahuatlán, que es su comunidad indígena. Bueno, ¿cómo percibimos allá? Quizás el hecho importante sea ¿sí? Si eso es así, va a haber que repetir el ejercicio, lo que se dice que la militarización de la frontera norte y esos controles de seguridad interno son un mecanismo que ya va a disuadir los flujos migratorios, independientemente de que haya una oferta dinámica de trabajo o no. Entonces, ha caído las personas que vienen a Estados Unidos sin papeles, que es el verde que está abajo. Usted se iría sin tener papeles, se nos cayó. Pero que quieren venirse acá, no ha caído. Que quieren trabajar acá, tampoco, pero ya lo piensan para venirse sin papeles, que es la gráfica verde. Bueno, ya dejo esto, que son las fuentes, por si a alguien le interesará cuántas encuestas, dónde se hicieron, grado de error, grado de confianza. Entonces, finalmente, ¿qué tenemos? Caída de la inmigración, caída de las remesas, caída de los stocks y tenemos problemas allá que no hemos logrado reconvertir o cambiar las condiciones que propiciaron la inmigración, sino al contrario, estructuralmente, digamos, las condiciones macroeconómicas son para que sigan saliendo y no para que retornen. Ese es un poco. Gracias, Roberto.
A man who had immigrated to New York through Ellis Island recalled years later, "When I saw the skyscrapers, I was crazy with joy." That's an old story, except, and you know where I'm going, except that he came not from Europe, but from Mexico. This newcomer from the Yucatan, and others like him, embodied both of the principal U.S. immigration patterns of the 20th century, that is, through Ellis Island and from Mexico. Of course, as Professor Galvez noted, Mexicans had been in New York forever, including, I'm reminded, in the 1860s, the Juaristas, who were organized here and lobbied President Johnson, Andrew Johnson, and hasta la familia del benemérito presidente was here in New York in the 1860s. But it was a century ago that corporate investments increasingly linked the Manhattan to the region, spurring shipping lines and with them migration to New York. Juan May arrived in Manhattan from the Yucatan in 1927, crazy with joy at the sight of the skyline. He also recalled having been exploited in his first backbreaking job here, even as he soon found work as a mechanic through some family friends who were already in New York. For her part, Mercedes Duarte, also from the Yucatan, was able to parlay her skill as a seamstress into a job designing fine lingerie. Even though she didn't get credit for her designs, she never regretted her decision to emigrate. Indeed, most of her family members soon followed, including her mother, who arrived in 1928, but who died within a year and was buried in a Long Island cemetery. Of course, not all of these early Mexican immigrants arrived by ship. Some undertook that long, arduous trek, thousands of miles overland, often with a stay in the Midwest along the way. As historian David Badillo has pointed out, David Badillo of CUNY, who's chairing one of the wonderful panels today, as Professor Badillo has noted, quote, "Their odysseys to New York usually covered a period of 3 years or longer, before finally picking up a trade or becoming expert machinists commanding high salaries by the time they reached New York," end quote. Those who made the long overland journey also included some creative types like Gabriel Romero, who was a dancer and an artist, visual artist, and he came from central Mexico with his family to the Texas region, like so many, but he alone went on all the way to New York and set up a cabaret act in the 1920s featuring the tango and the Latin lover theme when Rudolph Valentino was all the rage. The most important Mexican immigrants to the New York cultural scene at that time, however, arguably were two women, composer Maria Grever and author Maria Cristina Mena. Maria Cristina Mena's father was a Yucatecan and a partner in several New York business firms, and at age 14 she was sent to New York as Mexico was heading toward revolution. This was in 1907, and by 1914 this young woman was placing stories in one of the main US magazines of the time, The Century. For her part, Maria Grever came to New York in 1916 from Mexico City. She had spent some of her youth in Europe, including music training with Claude Debussy. Christened Maria Joaquina de la Portilla Torres, by the early 1920s, she was writing best-selling songs that landed her a contract with Paramount Pictures, even as the studio ordered her to change her name in the face of xenophobia, in the words of one of her biographers. As Maria Grever, she scored hits in the US and throughout Latin America. Such elite immigrants were the exception, however, according to a 1927 study that Professor Calderon mentioned by Manuel Gamio. It was done for the Social Science Research Council. But even for those Mexicans migrating from the large working class, for Mexicans coming in general to the US at this time, entering the country legally was not usually a serious obstacle, for no numerical limit on Mexican immigration to the United States would be enacted until 1965, and it would go into effect in 1968. For the few thousand immigrating to New York, that doesn't mean it was a bed of roses, right? Things were not easy. They were isolated, they faced frigid winters, many suffered from tuberculosis or pneumonia. And nearly every day, the Mexican consulate received news of deaths. More than a few eventually left New York for the Southwest or Mexico. At the same time, New York City offered some clear advantages over the Southwest. Mexicans in New York attracted relatively little attention, while, as you know, in the Southwest, the longtime Mexican presence, ironically, was often met with prejudice and segregation. And there would be mass deportations in the 1930s and again in 1954 on the flimsiest of charges. Meanwhile, Gamio noted, quote, "In New York, where racial and cultural prejudices exist least, the Mexican draftsman and painter contribute to the best papers and magazines," end quote. Not that New York was devoid of prejudice, with Gamio's own research revealing that a New York state judge ruled that Mexican immigrants could not apply for US citizenship if they had any Indian heritage. It was only pressure from the consul and the State Department, which feared an international incident, that forced the judge to finally back down. Both the challenges and opportunities of New York led folks to band together. Maria Lopez set up Casa Maria as a sort of settlement house for young women. She also founded Comité Guadalupano, which presaged the Guadalupan organization of more recent vintage, Asociación Tepeyac, with its own Comités Guadalupanos, as ably documented and laid out for us by Alicia Galvez in Guadalupe in New York. And of course, and she has pointed out that Asociación Tepeyac would constitute the leading edge of today's Mexican immigrant organizing in New York. In this earlier period, other Mexican organizations included Centro Mexicano and Cruz Azul, or Mexican Blue Cross. Cruz Azul Mexicana emphasized disaster relief and charity work and was run by women in connection with the council. This New York chapter was but one of many Cruz Azul chapters across the country. As such, Cruz Azul may well have constituted the first national Latina organization in the history of the United States. Numerous as they were, these Cruz Azul brigadas, as they were called, were outnumbered by the Mutualista societies active in virtually every US-Mexican settlement, no matter how small or how far from the border, including, yes, New York, where the most prominent organization was the Sociedad Mutualista Mexicana. Founded in 1924, it pledged to unite the great Mexican community that resides in New York for material and moral assistance, social improvement, and for improving Mexico's name, and to enjoy each other's company. Sociedad Mutualista Mexicana sponsored fundraisers that sometimes were grand affairs, as there was the time they celebrated Cinco de Mayo with 2 orchestras at the Waldorf Astoria. Still, Sociedad Mutualista Mexicana did seek to unite the greater New York Mexican community in general. Tomorrow there will be a fiesta to found a school and later a Mexican institution in New York. We are building, capital letters, construyendo. Soon we will have connections with all the Mexican organizations that exist in the US. And they started by linking up with the Mexican Aztec Society of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. But Sociedades Mutualistas in general went into decline in the 1930s, saddled with expensive burial insurance programs at a time when so many of their members were losing their jobs. In New York, Sociedad Mutualista Mexicana was eclipsed by the aforementioned Centro Mexicano, with its links to the growing Puerto Rican community and with Centro Mexicano's highly visible public programs from lectures and concerts to folk dance lessons. By 1939, Centro Mexicano had 40 members and a mailing list of some 400 people. El Centro Mexicano and several other organizations remained active even as Mexican immigration to New York declined to almost nothing because of the Depression, and then with the henequen export, the main export from Yucatan area was henequen, and it was increasingly replaced by synthetics. And so the shipping lines dried up, and so it was harder to come. These New York Mexican groups nonetheless hung on. They managed to keep on, ironically ending up fading, just as the main story we're seeing today, just as the main story of Mexican New York was unfolding in the recent decades. A story told so well by Robert Smith's landmark book, Mexican New York, Transnational Lives of New Immigrants. This first cohort of Mexican immigrants to New York, while small in number, left its mark in emphasizing community-based mutual aid and a cultural sensibility that transcended borders. Such groups anticipated some of today's New York Mexican organizations. These early New York Mexicans also left some enduring cultural contributions, such as the songs of Maria Grever, who declared, "Es mi deseo y ambición presentar las melodías y ritmos nativos en perspectiva real, pero con la flexibilidad necesaria para ser una llamada al oído universal." Take the case of her famed song, Júrame, Júrame. It was published in 1926, but just to give one recent example, in 2010, the Los Angeles Philharmonic played it at its gala opening night concert, which was broadcast nationally by PBS. Doubtless, Maria Grever would be gratified that people across the US continue to appreciate her music. At the same time, she would likely be astounded at the number of her compatriots who have come here in recent years, even as she doubtless would be surprised, if not dismayed, that US immigration policy today is so different from that under which Mexicans came a century ago. Though, of course, this policy is increasingly being characterized as unworkable, isn't it? So, fingers crossed. Meanwhile, let me close with a 2-minute clip of the LA Phil playing Júrame.
Grande en ese mundo que el cariño que te di. Bésame con un beso enamorado, como nadie me ha besado desde el día en que nací. Quiéreme hasta la locura. Si sabrás la amargura que estoy sufriendo por ti.
this was really a great panel. I really enjoyed it. I'll make a couple, I'll raise a few questions and a few comments, and then we'll turn it over for questions. So I really, as always, I really appreciated Laird's crunching of the numbers in an insightful way, and I was particularly pleased that he was taking a swing at the gloom and doom image that seems to be existing so unchallenged in such an unchallenged form about the state of Mexican New York. In fact, and I think his breaking it out by nativity is very, very important, because in fact, U.S.-born kids are incorporating pretty nicely, and CUNY has played a very important role in that. It used to be 32% of U.S.-born Mexican kids went to college, and now 51% go. And it used to be they mostly went to private colleges, and they mostly go now to public colleges, which in New York mainly means CUNY. And while I don't have all the data on this, I think a lot of this has to do with the work of the Commission over the last 10 years, and starting with the conversations that we had way back when at trying to get CUNY to target the Mexican community. And I think that's a very good thing, and I applaud Laird taking aim at that image. One of the things he didn't talk about much, because it's in the census, but I think is the white elephant in the room, is legal status. And in fact, if you create a class of people who are almost permanently barred from legal status, which is what we have created in the United States over the last 25 years, you're going to get bad social outcomes. And so, in fact, I think what we have here, I've written about this in other contexts, is a natural experiment, where in 1986 we did an inclusionary experiment where we legalized a bunch of people, and lo and behold, now 25 years later, they and their children are doing better. We then made it almost impossible to legalize for the subsequent 25 years, and guess what's happening? They're not doing as well, and their long-term trajectories are not as good. And I think then we are creating the thing we fear through our public policies, and I think that's a very important thing to take away. Now, if we're thinking about immigration reform and what the implications of, because here's one of the problems, and this goes back to Leticia. I really appreciated your walking through all the images of Mexicans in research and in public discussion over time. At this point in time, I think you could say, arguably, but I think I'm right, that in public discourse and in many places, being Mexican means being illegal to many Americans. In research that I have done in the field, people talk about Latinos, and if you did a Venn diagram of the Latinos and Mexicans being here and undocumented people being here, for a lot of Americans, those two circles completely overlap. Every Latino person is a potential illegal. For example, in a voting context, make sure they don't vote. Make sure that they're not illegals. They're trying to take over. And I think this is a very, very dangerous thing, which has come out almost directly as a result of our public policies. When we have kept a huge segment of our population in an undocumented status for so many years, in fact, there becomes a very strong association between being Mexican and being undocumented, particularly in new areas of immigration. That's very dangerous for American democracy and very dangerous for the long-term prospects of Mexicans and others. And I think that's a very important thing. One of the things that Laird talked about was the income. I've been doing a study I followed the same 100 children of Mexican immigrants for the last 10 to 15 years. One of the things that and about a third of them were undocumented at some point in the study. Now, one of the good things about being in the field, the bad thing is you get older. I had only gray hair and a lot of it when I started this study. Now you can see my sons are saying, "Look, Dad, you have a forehead where you're supposed to have hair, and you're growing something in the back here where you're supposed to have hair." Well, anyway, that's different. But the good part about it is you get outcomes without, if you wait a long time, you find out what happens. So all the kids I started following when they were 15, 18, and 20 are now late 20s and early 30s. One of the things that has happened is that the children who were category changers, who went from being undocumented to documented, do as well or better in the long run as the U.S.-born kids. And they're doing pretty well. This is not like a story of people being utterly miserable and poor to being slightly less miserable and poor. In fact, nearly half of the data set that I have, nearly half those kids are in college or some have gone to graduate school. 15% gone to graduate school, and 30% or so gone to college. And then there's about 30% that are what I call shallow slopers, who are not rich, but they're not poor. They work as travel agents, benefits administrators for a union, things like that. They have jobs, they feel successful, they have paid vacation, they have health insurance. They are not an underclass in the way that most images of Mexicans in New York would create them. So then let's think a little bit about the ideas for reform. DACA, for example, one of the problems with and this comes back to Leticia, one of the problems right now is that, particularly when we're trying to negotiate immigration reform, is that the Republicans in Congress and others in Congress, Tea Party people, feel like they got tricked with IRCA. In 1986, it was said if we legalize people, it will stop the flows, right? And what's happened is that the flows continued, and they said, look, you had family reunification, and all these people brought their families, and it only increased flows. And in a certain sense, they made and it wasn't like there weren't 1,000 academics saying if you do a legalization program, there will be more people in the short and medium run. Everybody knew that this would happen. This isn't to say that it was a bad thing to do that, right? Because I think you have to balance a variety of good and positive outcomes here. But one of the things that's interesting then is there's a belief that if you legalize people now, we're going to have the floodgates will just open. But for example, DACA, I don't think is going to add very much. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals is not going to add very many new people, if any, because it only applies to people who are already here. I would also say that if we had comprehensive immigration reform with family reunification, it will not increase the bump. It will not provide a demographic bump of the same kind that IRCA did before. One of the things that when Laird was talking about, speculating about the decrease in the growth rate, I agree with him on that. One of the reasons that we had such a massive growth rate between 90 and 2000 was that you had a massive amount of family reunification. And the reason you had such a massive amount of family reunification is because the pattern was much more circular migration. Then you had a lot more men in New York and in the United States who had families back home. Now, most of those families, over half of them, have given up on the idea of being able to reunite legally, and they've brought people up. There's a lot less circular migration. People come once, then go back and get their families and stay. So there will be less family reunification as a result of that, and less of a big bump. So I think that that's something that's very important. In terms of the long-term prospects for Mexicans in New York, a thing that needs to be considered is that there's an increasing percentage of the community which is indigenous. There's now over 10% of the population in New York speaks an indigenous language. The largest group is 4%, which is Mixtecos. The next largest is Nahuatl, and then Zapoteco, and then smaller percentages of others. And these are people who come usually on average with lower levels of education. They may have suffered more discrimination in Mexico. They come here, their networks are less. There are higher levels of, in my student Guillermo Irizar, altos niveles de precariedad. Very high levels of precariousness, and that's a thing that's going to be important. So, all right. One other image I want to throw out here in the spirit of Leticia's long-term analysis is this image of los héroes de México, el imagen neoliberal de los héroes que van a salvar a México, right? Well, we've got this idea that migrants, as the neoliberal state has contracted and invested less in public works, you've got this 1,000 points of light rhetoric where no, we don't need to spend all that money because the migrants are going to come back, their remittances are going to generate income in the economy, and it's going to make Mexico better. It's a really appealing image, right? It's a sort of transnational bootstrap argument. But whether remittances turn into productive, whether they just turn into consumption or they turn into production, etc., depends on lots of things, including the local economy and including the kinds of institutions that support that. You cannot have a vibrant economy without a state that is vibrantly engaged in helping to produce that economy, the growth in that economy, particularly if the state is withdrawing as severely as it is in many places. So Sergio's paper, the facts here, I'm really, you know, I've had my finger has not been, oh, you've gone someplace, there you are. My finger has not been on the numbers of this lately, and I'm frankly quite shocked and interested in the numbers that you're presenting. And I wanted to ask you to speculate a little bit about the, one of the things I wanted to bring up here is there's been a decrease in the flow and an increase in the number of deportations. I think one of the reasons we have fewer undocumented people than we had 4 or 5 years ago is that we've deported 4 million of them over the Obama's administration and after. Obama has been the deportation president. And it's a mantle he hasn't claimed, obviously. I think part of it has been a political strategy to say the border's secure, I am as hard. It's like Democrats being tough on the Russians during the Cold War, right? I'm going to be really tough on this thing that's of interest to my constituency so we can pass immigration reform. The lesson I think he's beginning to learn is that the Republicans don't care whether he cuts the budget or is tough or not. They're just going to keep saying he's a communist who's a Muslim who was born outside the United States and needs to not be president. Right? I think that there's and I'm exaggerating slightly, there's a certain intransigent wing that will not see him as a legitimate president no matter what. But I think hopefully there's more of a temperate wing. A temperate might be an exaggerated word, but a less intransigent wing. But I wanted to get you to speculate a little bit on the last slide, or one of the last 2 slides that you talked about, that there's a decreasing number of undocumented people, but people leaving in an undocumented status, but not a decrease in the number of people who want to come. And hay una disminución de la gente que se vayan, pero no en la gente que quieren salir. No, y esto me interesaba mucho. And final comments here are to thank you very much to Julie for your longitudinal perspective and your lovely historical stories, and the music, of course, was very nice. It's interesting, I was thinking as you were talking of the stories that migrants told me about the McBurney Y, where the Mexican Center was opened in 1923, the Yucatecos, right, the sort of original, the OGs of migration in New York. And I was thinking also, we're going to hear from Federico Besserer a little later, I was thinking of the global, transnational, it's a newish word, 20 years old now, but there was a tremendous transnational link in those days because the Yucatecos were coming on the transportation technology that was coming out because of the transnational hemp trade. And then the global affairs of World War I, for example, greatly curtailed the ease and safety of that travel. And by the 20s, things started to slow down. And by the 40s, with World War II, there were synthetics, and that trade had greatly dried up. So that's why New York is not full of Yucatecos. But it is full of poblanos and guerrerenses and oaxaqueños and others. And just to add a slight historical note, Don Pedro Simón, his brother Fermín, and their friend whose name I cannot remember, crossed the border on July 4th, 1943. They did not have enough money to bribe their way into bracero contracts. They were actually living outside the Mixteca to avoid political violence in their hometown. They were in Mexico City. They met a guy from New York who brought them to New York, put them up, and because there was a labor shortage because it was World War II, they got jobs like that. That's where the flujo from the Mixteca begins. So anyway, I think, so that no one holds up the stop sign for me, I'm going to stop there and see if you know what, before we get the panelists to respond, why don't we have about 10 minutes. So let's do this. Let's get 3, and you guys can respond to me or not. It's fine. We can talk after. And let's get 3 questions and then responses. Sir. Oh, and there's a mic. Thank you. There's a microphone on the far side, but if you want to just stand up and say your question loudly, that's fine too. But it's got to be louder. We need the mic. Oh, the web stream. Sorry. We're digital here.
Speak up.
For Dr. Laird, it seems to me like your paper or your recent research is quite political in the sense that the intransigent sort of members of the Republican Party consistently challenges pro-Hispanic legislation by arguing that Hispanics in general don't assimilate.
You know what? I'm going to cut you off because your question's very good, and I want to give Laird some time to answer. But and I'm sorry to do that, but we only have 10 minutes. Sir? Let's get three questions and then let's get three questions and then you can answer whichever one.
I might forget the question.
Testing, testing.
Go ahead.
1 second.
I'm going to try to compress it, but in regards to the data, and sort of backing up on what Robert said, is that the whole issue of indigenous in terms of the demographics is that in the census, like a lot of indigenous don't identify as Hispanic. So the numbers you gave for Mexican are under the category of Hispanic, and if you look at the non-Indian numbers, the non-Indians who are Mayan or whatever has actually grown by 75% from 2000 to 2010. And so the whole issue is in New York, there is an augmented number of people from Mexico who are indigenous. And this is shown up in the data for Mexico that shows that the indigenous regions of Mexico are increasing in terms of their percentages of migration as a percentage of the total. So I'd like to address that. And then secondly is that upcoming for 2020 census, as you know, they're trying to collapse the indigenous question with the the Hispanic question with the race question. So what implications does that have?
In Mexico or in the United States?
For 2020.
For which census?
The 2020 U.S. Census. They're trying to collapse question 8 and 9 in terms of race and Hispanic.
Okay, let me cut you off there. Get the next. I'm sorry, I don't.
And
mean
just
to
the last point
people.
is that there's 2% of Mexicans who don't have any papers, so they're doubly undocumented. And in terms of immigration.
Fair point. Ma'am?
Esta pregunta es para el profesor Cortés. Yo trabajo también en la frontera, entonces una de las ideas que se tiene es de que el flujo fronterizo va muy de la mano con la economía de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Entonces yo no sé si sus datos le permiten especular sobre la recesión. Bueno, yo recuerdo que en el 2001 hubo una recesión, bajó el flujo. En el 2005 con lo de las casas aumenta y baja, ¿no? Entonces no sé si podríamos hablar de algún patrón que va mucho más allá de estos últimos 3 o 4 años en cuestión del flujo y la economía.
Okay, respuestas. Laird, I hope you didn't forget your answer.
I forgot the question. It's not if you forgot the answer. On the question of political implications and the issue of assimilation. Assimilation is a dirty word in some circles, and I think it's a very controversial word. I wrote a book that was published in 2010 on Latinos in the United States, and what I argued is that contrary to what has been very popular is Latinos seem to emulate patterns of prior immigrant groups that arrived in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, and the early 20th century. That is, over time, they become more integrated into the overall society. Notice I'm avoiding the word assimilation. When we use scientific measures, such as educational attainment, such as income, such as linguistic preference at home, such as the whole issue of bilingualism, which declines over time. Now, with respect to Mexicans and Mexican Americans, in the New York area, this is a recent group, so we don't have this long-term perspective. It's very difficult to predict the future. If I had a crystal ball, I wouldn't be in the academic racket. I'd be making fortunes predicting the future quite accurately. I can't do that. Yes, it's a political argument, but both the left and the right find it objectionable. My book that I published in 2010, when I made this argument, was slammed by all the, let's call them leftists, who said, oh no, discrimination and racism makes Latinos different. Discrimination and racism exist in this society. One is not going to negate that. I don't negate that, but the long-term tendencies seem to suggest, as Rob observed, that after the domestic-born Mexicans and other groups seem to perform better over the long haul, period. So that's what I have to say on that. With respect to indigenous population in New York, I can only work with the cards I'm dealt with. The materials that are released by the U.S. government census surveys don't yet delineate with precision the different indigenous groups here. What I certainly acknowledge your point, and the point that was made by Rob, that the number of indigenous people of Mexican origin are increasing. But I think at this point, they still represent a very, very tiny percentage of the overall Mexican community in the tri-state area. Certainly an issue to be reckoned with, and certainly an issue to be reckoned with respect to the future prospects of better integration into the dominant society.
You know, a related point to this, I'll grab only 20 seconds here, is that there are the indigenous population in the tri-state area is not spread out evenly. So you've got places like, where's Rutgers? New Brunswick, New Jersey. There's a very high population, very large population of Mixtecos, and you go to upstate New York to certain agricultural industries there, and you have a lot of Zapotecos. So there are concentrations. So in fact, there may be points of actionable intervention related to these groups. There is also a large spread out population, but not all of them. Sergio, you had a question from me and from the young person.
Gracias. Sí, hay una relación directa entre migración y empleo, pero ya para estudiar a nivel de localidad o municipio es insuficiente porque, por ejemplo, en nuestro caso, que cayó el flujo migratorio en 45% para toda la República, si lo ubicamos para Puebla, ese 45% se nos hace 7%. Entonces ahí vienen otros factores. Fernando Herrera tiene un trabajo sobre eso, sobre redes sociales, la forma en que se integran los trabajadores a los mercados. Entonces, en el caso de Nueva York, hay más estabilidad en el empleo. Entonces, ¿por qué es menos sensible? Bueno, no tienen los problemas que tienen los que están en la construcción. Entonces, depende del tipo de profesión, de cómo se integran, la fortaleza o no de las redes sociales. Entonces, sí, pero sí son más sensibles a lo que pasa en Estados Unidos que a lo que pasa en México. Eso sí, es un hecho que se puede macroeconómicamente argumentar.
Okay. We're at about 8.5 minutes. We can take 2 more questions and then not answer them, or we can wrap up now. So we'll wrap up now. So thank you for your attention, everybody. Thank you. These were very interesting.